The sun was setting slowly, pouring soft golden light across the wide open land. The sky above the desert plain was painted with shades of orange, pink, and purple, like a giant watercolor painting made by nature itself. It was summer in the borderlands, and everything was quiet except for the sound of crickets and the gentle flow of water. The river near the cottonwood grove had always been a place of calm. For generations, it was known by the local Apache people as a place of rest, a safe corner of the land where wind met water, and silence carried meaning. Thomas James, a young rancher in his early 20s, was finishing a long day of work. His family's ranch was a few miles west of the river. He had spent the whole day checking the fences, guiding the cattle, and making sure no strays were lost. His hands were rough, his boots were dusty, and his face carried the tired look of a man who worked under the sun from dawn to dusk. But inside him, Thomas had a restless heart. He often felt like the wide land around him held stories bigger than the fences he mended. That evening, when the last of the cattle were settled, Thomas decided to ride toward the river. It was not part of his plan. He didn't have a clear reason. Sometimes he just liked to be near the sound of flowing water. It made him feel less lonely. The river had a special pull, like it belonged to something older than time. He untied his horse, Dusty, and rode off into the open field. The cool wind touched his face as he rode. The prairie grass whispered as the horse's hooves brushed through it. The world around him smelled like wild sage and warm earth. In the distance, the cottonwood trees near the river rose tall, their green leaves swaying in the soft breeze. The air grew cooler as he approached the grove, and he could already hear the steady rhythm of the flowing water. It was a peaceful sound, the kind that seemed to wash away the noise of the world. Thomas slowed his horse to a gentle walk as he reached the edge of the grove. He dismounted, tying Dusty to a low branch. He liked to sit by the river sometimes, watch the water move, and let his thoughts wander. Life as a rancher was simple but lonely. He didn't talk much to people outside of town. The land was quiet most days. In that quiet, he often found himself listening more than speaking. Tonight felt no different. But as he stepped closer to the riverbank, something unusual caught his attention. There was movement in the clearing ahead. It wasn't an animal. It was too graceful for that. He stopped where the trees began to thin, his boots sinking softly into the damp soil. The golden light of the setting sun shone through the branches, creating a soft curtain of shadows and light. Through that curtain, Thomas saw a young woman at the river's edge. She stood in the shallows, the water reaching just below her knees. Her long dark hair fell loose down her back, shining like black silk in the sunset. She moved slowly and calmly, like someone who belonged to the land in a way he could never claim. Her skin glowed warm under the fading sunlight, and her steps were as light as the wind itself. Thomas had seen Apache camps from a distance before. He had passed their riders on trails, but he had never been this close to someone from the tribe without a group around. The girl at the river seemed unaware of him at first. She bent slightly, touching the water with both hands, letting it run over her fingers. It was a quiet and natural moment, as if she had done it 100 times before. There was no fear in her movements, no rush, just peace. He didn't know why he froze in place. Perhaps it was surprise. Perhaps it was the rare beauty of the moment. He knew it wasn't right to stand there, but for a brief second it felt like time stopped. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. The water sparkled around her legs, reflecting the warm light like little stars. Her reflection moved gently with the ripples. Thomas took a slow step back, trying not to make a sound. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to frighten her, but a dry branch cracked softly beneath his boot. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet evening, even the smallest sound traveled like an echo. The young woman's head turned slightly. She didn't startle. She didn't shout. She just listened. Thomas froze completely this time. His breath caught in his chest. The cottonwood leaves rustled softly in the wind. She straightened slowly, her eyes scanning the tree line. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the curtain of leaves and fading light. Hers were dark, sharp, and clear. She did not look afraid. She looked aware. She looked like someone who had spent her whole life in a world where one small sound could mean everything. Thomas's heart beat louder than the river itself. His mind was racing. He knew how this might look. A young rancher standing in the shadows, watching an Apache girl at the water. It was not a story that ended well in these parts of the country. He wasn't there to harm her, but how could she know that? The girl tilted her head slightly, almost as if trying to see him more clearly. She wrapped a light deerskin cloth around herself, not hurriedly, but with quiet, calm hands. She was not ashamed. She was not weak. She moved like someone who had learned strength from the earth itself. Thomas felt a mix of guilt and wonder that made his stomach twist. The sun dipped lower, painting the river in deeper shades of red and gold. A cool breeze moved through the trees, lifting a few loose strands of her hair. Thomas thought about leaving, about turning away and pretending he had never come this far. But something in her gaze held him there. Not because it was soft, but because it was firm. She was not just a girl. She was a guardian of a place he had stepped into without being invited. She took a step forward onto the riverbank. The wet ground didn't seem to bother her bare feet. The sound of the water behind her grew fainter, as the distance between them grew smaller. Thomas wanted to step back again, but he couldn't. He felt rooted to the ground like one of the cottonwood trees. The air around them thickened with the weight of silence. Neither spoke, yet both understood something had changed. Thomas had lived on the land for years, but in that single quiet moment, he realized how little of it truly belonged to him. He had built fences, moved cattle, and claimed acres, but this river, this grove, belonged to her people in ways deeper than land deeds or ranch maps could ever say. She walked with the confidence of someone who carried generations behind her. He stood there, a guest who had walked in uninvited. The woman stopped a few feet away from where the trees met the open clearing. The distance between them was still safe, but close enough that Thomas could see the strength in her expression. There was no fear in her. There was also no kindness yet. Just a sharp, steady look that asked silently why he was there. Thomas opened his mouth slightly, but no words came out. He wasn't sure what to say that wouldn't sound foolish. He couldn't explain that he had simply followed the sound of the river. He couldn't explain how stillness had turned into something more complicated. She didn't ask him anything out loud, but her eyes held questions. They also held power. In that moment, Thomas understood something he had never truly thought about before. The world wasn't just made of land and work and long days. It was also made of stories, of people whose lives were tied to places in ways deeper than he could see. He was a stranger here, not just a man near a river, and she was not just someone passing by. She was part of the land, the kind of part no fence could ever keep out. The sky continued to darken. The soft pink light slowly gave way to a gentle purple twilight. A few stars appeared faintly in the east. The water behind her whispered softly against the shore. Thomas shifted his weight nervously, unsure of what would happen next. He had not planned for this. He had not expected to be standing here, caught in a moment that felt both fragile and unshakable. She did not speak, but she took one more step forward, steady and unhurried. That was enough to make Thomas's heart beat even faster. She was walking toward him with the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't afraid to be seen, someone who could stand her ground without raising her voice. In the distance, a bird called out once, then silence fell again. The night air wrapped around them like a thin blanket, cool and still. Thomas realized that he could no longer pretend to be invisible. She had seen him. She knew he was there. And whatever happened next, he would have to face it. Not as a rancher, not as someone from a different world, but as a man who had stepped across an unseen line. He stood still, his breath uneven, watching as she came closer. She carried herself with quiet strength, and there was something in her eyes, something that made him feel both smaller and more awake than he had ever felt before. The river behind her kept flowing, as if reminding them both that the land had seen moments like this long before they were born, and it would see many more long after they were gone. And as the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, their silent standoff at the river's edge became a moment neither of them would ever forget. The world around them seemed to grow quieter after that moment by the river. The birds that had been calling earlier disappeared into the trees. The air had a cool edge now, carrying the soft scent of the water and wet earth. Thomas stood half hidden in the shadows, but it no longer mattered. The young woman, Ayana, had seen him. There was no pretending anymore. Ayana's steps were steady, her chin lifted slightly, her eyes fixed on him. She wasn't walking fast, but every step made the space between them smaller, like a slowly closing door. Her blanket was wrapped tightly around her shoulders now, and a single braid had formed down her back. The quiet confidence in the way she moved made Thomas feel even more out of place. Thomas shifted his boots slightly in the dirt. A mix of worry and shame settled deep in his chest. He had spent most of his life feeling at home on the land, but right now he felt like a stranger trespassing somewhere sacred. The trees around them swayed in the light wind, their leaves whispering like they were watching a story unfold. Ayana stopped a few steps away from where he stood. The setting sun had nearly disappeared now, leaving the world painted in soft twilight. Her dark eyes caught what little light remained, making them shine faintly like polished stone. Thomas didn't know what to say. His tongue felt heavy and his thoughts ran in circles. For a long, stretched moment, they just stood there, neither moving nor speaking. The only sound was the steady flow of the river behind her. Then, with a calm voice, soft but firm, she spoke. "I can see you," she said slowly, her words carrying a clear tone. Thomas swallowed hard. He hadn't expected her to speak first, and the sound of her voice made his heart beat faster. It wasn't angry. It wasn't frightened. It was strong, like someone who was used to standing on her own 2 feet. He stepped forward just slightly into the fading light so she could see his face. "I didn't mean to," he started, but his voice cracked a little. He wasn't even sure what words to use. I was just walking. I didn't know anyone was here." Ayana tilted her head slightly, studying him. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she let the silence between them stretch, making every second feel longer. Thomas wanted to fill the silence, but something in her gaze told him it was better to wait. Finally, she said, "This is our place. We come here when the sun goes down. You should not be here without calling out." Her words were clear and her accent carried the rhythm of her people. She spoke English carefully, as if choosing each word with care. Thomas lowered his eyes for a moment. He knew she was right. He had walked in without thinking, like he owned the place. But this land wasn't truly his, no matter what a piece of paper said. He looked up again and spoke, his voice quieter now. "I'm sorry," he said honestly. "I didn't mean any harm. I shouldn't have come this close without asking." Ayana watched him carefully. She wasn't someone easily fooled by soft words. Her people had lived through too many broken promises. But there was something about the way he said it, not rushed, not proud, that made her keep listening. The river kept flowing behind her, steady and patient. A coyote howled in the far distance, a lonely sound that echoed through the empty plains. The night was slowly taking over the sky, painting it in dark blue and silver. Thomas shifted his weight, unsure of what she might do next. He had heard stories from other ranchers, stories full of warnings and old bitterness. But this was not a story from someone else's mouth. This was real. She stood right in front of him, her strength quiet but clear. Ayana took another step closer, not because she trusted him yet, but because she refused to step back. She pointed gently toward the river with her hand. "This is a sacred place," she said. "It is not just a river to us. It is where we listen to the land. You should have stayed on your side." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand," he said softly. And he meant it. He had always loved the river, but only as a place to escape his own thoughts. To her people, it meant something far deeper. She narrowed her eyes slightly, still studying him. "Then why were you hiding?" she asked. Her question felt sharp but fair. Thomas felt a deep flush rise to his face. He wished he could turn back time, walk away before she ever saw him. But the truth was simple. "I didn't mean to hide," he said, voice shaking just a little. "I came to the river. I saw you. I should have turned around. But I didn't. That was wrong. I'm sorry." Ayana stood quietly for a few seconds that felt much longer than they were. She wasn't smiling, but she also wasn't shouting. She was measuring him, weighing his words carefully. Then something small shifted in her eyes. Not forgiveness yet, but understanding that he was not lying. She had lived long enough to know when a person spoke from fear, pride, or honesty. "You do not belong here," she said simply. "But you can leave." Thomas nodded again, more firmly this time. "Yes, I'll go," he said. He took a small step back, but his boots crunched softly against the earth. The night wind brushed past them, carrying the soft sound of rustling grass. But before he could turn, she spoke again. "You come here often?" Her tone was not gentle, but curious. Thomas hesitated. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I bring my horse to drink. I like the quiet." "I didn't know it was your people's place." She nodded once, slowly. "Now you know," she said. "Next time you make a sound when you come. You show respect. My people do not want trouble, but we see everything that happens near the river." Her words carried a weight beyond her years. Thomas guessed she might be around his age, maybe a little younger, but she spoke like someone raised to carry responsibilities. The stars were brighter now. The moon had started to rise, a silver curve just above the tree line. Its light spilled over the river, making it glow softly. Dusty, Thomas's horse, moved restlessly where he was tied, sensing the tension. Thomas looked at Ayanna again. He didn't know what to say to make the air between them less heavy. He could only speak the truth. "I'm truly sorry," he said again, his voice low but steady. "I'll be careful from now on." For the first time, something almost like softness flickered in her eyes. It wasn't a smile, but it wasn't as sharp as before either. "Words are not enough," she said, "but maybe they are a beginning." She took a deep breath, and her shoulders lowered just a little, as if the weight on them had lightened. She then looked toward the cottonwood trees, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere in the darkness, 2 faint whistles echoed back. She didn't react like someone startled. It was more like she expected it. Thomas followed her gaze, but saw nothing. She turned back to him. "Others are nearby," she said quietly. "You should go before they come. They will not understand you the way I do now." Her voice wasn't a threat. It was a warning, honest and clear. Thomas felt a wave of relief and nervousness at the same time. "Thank you," he said softly. Realizing she had just given him a way out of trouble, she didn't answer. She simply stepped back toward the riverbank, still watching him. Thomas untied Dusty slowly, his hands a little shaky. He climbed onto the saddle and looked at her one last time. She stood tall by the water, her hair moving gently in the wind, her blanket wrapped around her like a shield of quiet strength. Thomas felt something change inside him. He had come to the river as a man looking for quiet. He was leaving as a man who had been reminded that the land was not his alone. He had crossed an invisible line without meaning to, a line built on respect, history, and unspoken rules. As Dusty began to walk away, the sound of the horse's hooves mixed with the soft song of the river. Thomas glanced back once more. She was still there, standing at the edge of the water, watching him go. She didn't wave and she didn't smile, but the way she stood said everything. She had let him leave without fear, and that was not something to take lightly. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. The night stretched wide and the stars were bright above him. He could still see her face in his mind, the strength in her eyes, the steady way she had walked toward him, and the way her voice carried meaning without needing to shout. He had thought the land was quiet. Now he understood it was full of voices even when no one spoke. The horse's steady rhythm and the wind in the grass gave him time to think. He didn't feel proud of what had happened. He felt changed. Something had been planted deep inside him, something that would not leave him alone. And by the time the warm lights of the ranch came into view in the distance, Thomas knew this night would not be just a passing memory. It was a beginning. He didn't know of what, but he could feel it. For the next several days after the river encounter, Thomas could not shake the image of Ayanna from his mind. He went through his daily work on the ranch, mending fences, guiding cattle, cleaning the barn. But his thoughts wandered again and again to that moment when their eyes met through the cottonwood trees. The ranch had always been quiet, but now the silence felt different. It no longer calmed him. It made him think. When he walked through the fields at sunset, the orange light reminded him of how the sky had looked behind her. When the wind rustled through the grass, it sounded like the soft hush of the river that night. Even the steady steps of his horse seemed to carry him closer to something he didn't fully understand yet. Thomas had grown up in these borderlands. His father had built the ranch years ago. To him, this land had always been home, but now he felt like a guest in a place that held deeper stories he had never truly listened to. He began to notice things he used to ignore, the way the cottonwood trees curved around the river like they were protecting it, the faint stone carvings near the bank that he had always assumed were just marks from nature. Now he knew they weren't. Every night when the sun dipped behind the hills, he thought about going back to the river, not because he wanted to repeat what happened, but because something inside him wanted to understand what the land really meant. He felt an invisible thread pulling him toward that place. On the 4th evening, he gave in to that pull. As the sky turned gold, Thomas saddled Dusty again. The horse seemed to sense his mood, quiet, cautious, a little uncertain. The ride toward the cottonwood grove was slower than before. He didn't rush. He listened to the wind, to the sound of his horse's hooves pressing softly into the earth. He knew now that this was not just open land. It was shared ground, layered with meaning he didn't fully grasp yet. When he reached the edge of the grove, he stopped far earlier than he had the last time. The shadows were long now, and the soft sound of the river reached his ears like a song. He climbed down from Dusty and tied him to a sturdy branch, whispering to the horse as if trying to calm both of them. Thomas took a deep breath. This time he did not step silently into the clearing. Instead, he spoke softly toward the trees. "Hello," he said, though he didn't know if anyone would hear him. For a while there was no reply. Just the river moving and the wind answering in whispers. But then, like before, there was movement near the water. Ayanna stepped into the open. She wore a woven shawl draped across her shoulders, and her hair was in a single long braid. The soft moonlight painted her in silver and shadow. She didn't look surprised. She looked as though she had expected this. Thomas felt a nervous heat rise in his chest. But this time he didn't hide. He kept his hands visible at his sides, his voice steady. "I came back," he said carefully. Ayanna's dark eyes studied him, calm but serious. "I see," she answered softly. "Why?" Thomas searched for words. He didn't want to say something foolish. "To say sorry again," he said finally. "And to listen. I didn't understand before, but I want to." For a few seconds, Ayanna didn't speak. Then, with the same quiet confidence she had shown the first time, she walked toward him. She stopped a safe distance away, just as before. The sound of the river seemed to wrap around them like a soft blanket. "You are not from my people," she said slowly. "You are from the ranch on the west side." Thomas nodded. "Yes." "And you walked here without asking," she continued. "Yes," he said again. She tilted her head slightly. "And now you ask to stay?" Thomas hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said honestly. "I only ask to learn. And to respect." Ayanna's eyes softened slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it wasn't anger either. She turned and looked at the river behind her, the same way someone might look at an old friend. "This place," she said quietly, "is where our families come to speak with the spirits. We come here when we need strength. This water has carried our voices for a long time." Thomas listened carefully. Each word seemed to sink deep into the quiet air. "My people believe," as she continued, that the river remembers. It remembers who treats it with care. It remembers who does not. That night when you came, you did not speak to the river. You only watched. You were like a shadow. That is why it felt wrong." Thomas nodded, understanding now in a way he hadn't before. "I was wrong," he said. "I didn't know how much this place meant. But I do now. I won't be a shadow again." Ayanna looked at him for a long moment, her gaze firm but thoughtful. "Words are easy," she said softly. "The river listens to actions." Thomas didn't argue. He didn't try to defend himself. He just stood there, letting her words settle like stones at the bottom of the water. The wind picked up gently, brushing through the trees. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl hooted softly. The night was full of quiet voices if one chose to listen. Ayanna turned to face the river again. "There are others," she said. "They saw what happened. They did not speak to you that night, but they know. If you come here again, they will not be as patient as I am." Thomas felt the weight of her words. "I understand," he said. "I'll respect your space. I promise." But something unexpected happened next. Ayanna didn't turn away. She walked toward the river and crouched near the water. She cupped her hands, lifted the clear water to her lips, and drank slowly. Then she said, "If you truly want to learn, you must listen to the land, not just speak to it." Thomas didn't fully understand what she meant, but he nodded anyway. He took a step closer, not too close, just enough to feel the cool breath of the river. The sound of it filled his ears. For the next several minutes, neither of them spoke. They stood by the river like two people from different worlds, sharing the same heartbeat of the land. It was strange but not uncomfortable. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady. Ayanna finally rose to her feet. "There is more to this place than what your eyes can see," she said quietly. "You have been living on the land, but not with it. That is why the river saw you as a stranger." Her words struck him like a quiet truth. Thomas nodded again. "Then maybe it's time I start learning," he said softly. Ayanna did not smile, but her eyes seemed a little less guarded now. "Maybe," she answered. A faint whistle came again from the distance, soft, like a bird call. Ayanna turned her head slightly, listening. "My people are near," she said. You should leave before they find you here. They do not know your heart the way I do now. Thomas took a small step back, his boots crunching lightly against the soil. Will you be here again? He asked carefully. Ayanna didn't answer right away. She looked at the river, then at him. The river is always here, she said finally. It is not mine to keep from anyone. But respect is the key to standing beside it. Thomas understood. She wasn't promising to meet him again. She was reminding him of his responsibility. He untied Dusty slowly and climbed onto the saddle. Ayanna stood at the river's edge once more, her shawl moving softly in the wind. The moonlight made the water shine like silver around her feet. She looked strong, like part of the land itself. Thomas looked at her one last time before turning away. His heart felt both heavy and light, heavy with the weight of what he had done, but light because he had found something real, something that wasn't just about fences and cattle and long, empty days. As he rode back through the fields, the wind brushed against his face. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. He felt like the land was speaking not in words, but in the sound of the grass and the whisper of the river behind him. The next days at the ranch felt different. He started noticing small things he had never paid attention to before. The way the birds followed certain paths at dawn, the way the grass leaned in the wind, the faint patterns carved into stones near the water. He began to understand that the river wasn't just a line on a map. It was a living story. And every evening when the sun began to fall, Thomas felt the quiet pull of that story. It was not about returning to the river just to see her. It was about understanding a piece of land that had always been there but had never truly been his. The next few weeks changed the rhythm of Thomas's life. He still woke up at dawn, still fed the cattle, still rode the same dusty trails across the land, but something inside him had shifted quietly, like a river changing its path under the soil. He moved through each day not just as a rancher, but as someone who now carried a secret understanding, that the land was shared, living, and full of voices he had once ignored. He returned to the river often. Not every night and not with expectations, but when the day's work was done and the sun hung low in the sky, something in his heart guided him there. Sometimes he stood at the edge of the grove alone, listening to the soft rush of water. Sometimes he saw Ayanna. When she appeared, she didn't rush to greet him, and he didn't rush to speak. They stood at a respectful distance, their conversations as calm and measured as the flowing river beside them. Their connection was not one built on grand gestures or hurried words. It grew slowly, like the roots of the cottonwood trees that dug deep beneath the earth. Ayanna began to tell him small things about the river and the land. She spoke about how her people believed that water carried memory, how every stone and tree around the river was part of a story older than anyone alive. She told him about the wind that guided travelers and about the way the stars formed patterns her people followed long before fences were built. Thomas listened more than he spoke. He didn't want to fill the air with his voice. He wanted to understand. Sometimes after she finished speaking, the two of them stood in silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that feels like both hearts are hearing the same thing. But outside the quiet of the grove, the world was not as still. Word had started to move through the town and nearby ranches that Apache people were gathering closer to the river lately. There were whispers among ranchers about new boundaries, about trouble. Thomas heard these words when he went into town for supplies. They made him uneasy. The men at the saloon spoke with hard voices, full of judgment but without understanding. They think they can just camp closer, one man said bitterly. This is ranch land now. Thomas kept quiet. He wanted to speak, but he knew these men wouldn't listen to stories of rivers that remembered and stars that told paths. Their world was made of barbed wire and claims on paper. That night he rode to the river with a heavier heart than usual. Ayanna was already there, kneeling at the edge of the water. A lantern glowed softly beside her, painting her figure in a warm circle of light. When she turned to look at him, she could tell something was wrong. "You are carrying noise from the outside," she said calmly. Thomas nodded and dismounted. "People are talking," he said softly. "They're saying your people are moving closer to the river." Ayanna's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. "We have always been here," she said. "The river has no wall. It belongs to no one. We only follow its voice." "I know," Thomas said quickly. "I understand. But they don't. They don't see the land the way you do." She stood up slowly, the lantern's light catching the edge of her braid. "Then their eyes are closed." He didn't argue because he knew she was right. Ayana walked closer to him, her steps quiet but steady. "There will be a meeting soon," she said. "My uncle is an elder. The council will talk to your people. They want peace, but they will not step away from the river. This land is our story. We cannot leave it." Thomas looked down at the earth. His boots pressed into the soft soil near the riverbank. He felt torn between two worlds. The world he had grown up in and the world he was only now beginning to understand. "I don't want trouble," he whispered. She watched him carefully. "Then do not bring it," she said simply. The following week the meeting happened. It was held on a flat stretch of land near the river, under the shade of tall cottonwoods. The evening air was cool and still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A group of Apache elders stood on one side, their faces strong and calm. Ayana was among them, standing just behind her uncle. On the other side were ranchers and townsfolk, men Thomas had known all his life. His father was not there, but several neighboring ranch owners were. Thomas stood in the middle, not as a leader, not as a spokesman, but as someone who belonged to both worlds, and to neither completely. One of the ranchers spoke first, his voice carrying a hard edge. "This land was settled years ago. The river runs through our ranches. We need to keep things clear. We don't want people wandering close to our fences." An elder answered in a calm, steady tone. "We do not wander, we return. The river was here before your fences. It will be here after. We drink from it, we speak to it, and it knows our names." There was a murmur among the ranchers. Some shook their heads, others crossed their arms. Thomas saw the wall between the two groups, invisible but strong. Ayana's uncle continued to speak with quiet strength, explaining that they were not trying to take land, but to keep their connection to the river alive. Then one of the men, a tall rancher with sunburned skin, turned his gaze to Thomas. "You've been spending time here," he said bluntly. "Near their camp." "You've seen what's happening." The air around Thomas grew heavy. Every eye turned to him. Ayana looked at him too, not with fear but with trust. She was asking him to speak with truth. Thomas took a breath. "Yes," he said. "I've been here. I've listened. They're not trying to hurt anyone. This is their home too. We think we own the land because we built fences. But they belong to it in ways we don't understand. They don't want to fight. They just want respect." The words were simple, not grand, but they came from his heart. There was silence after he spoke. Some of the ranchers shifted uncomfortably. A few frowned, but there was no shouting, no raised voices. The river kept flowing softly in the background like a quiet witness. Ayana's uncle nodded once, acknowledging his words. "The river belongs to all who listen," he said, "but those who close their ears to it will never truly be here." The meeting stretched on, full of slow words and unspoken histories. It was not easy. The world was not built for easy answers. But something small changed that evening. For the first time, both sides stood on the same ground and looked at each other not as shadows but as people. After the meeting ended, most of the ranchers walked away with stiff shoulders and unsure steps. Some looked thoughtful. Others didn't want to listen. Change was slow, but it had begun. Thomas stayed behind. The night was cooler now, the stars bright overhead. Ayana approached him quietly. "You spoke," she said simply. He nodded. "I had to." She tilted her head. "Why?" He thought for a long moment before answering. "Because it's the truth. And because the river isn't just yours or mine, it's everything." For the first time since he met her, Ayana's expression softened into something close to a smile. A quiet, small smile, but one that carried warmth. "The river remembers," she said gently. "It heard you tonight." Thomas felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't pride. It was something quieter, like standing near a fire on a cold night. Over the next few nights, the riverbank felt different. It wasn't completely at peace yet. There were still fences, still lines on maps, still old mistrust in people's hearts. But there was also a fragile thread connecting both worlds. A thread made of honesty, respect, and a willingness to listen. Thomas returned often, not because he had to, but because it felt right. Ayana continued to meet him sometimes, not as an enemy, not even as a friend in the usual sense, but as someone who shared the same piece of sky and river. They began to speak more freely. She told him stories from her people's past, stories of rivers that sang, stars that guided, and families who lived in harmony with the land. In return, Thomas told her about the ranch, about the way he had grown up, about the long, quiet nights when the wind made him feel alone. They came from different worlds, but under the cottonwood trees, those worlds were not so far apart. One night, as they sat a few feet apart near the river, Thomas looked up at the stars. "You were right," he said softly. Ayanna looked at him. "About what?" "About listening," he replied. "I never heard the land before, but now, it feels like it talks all the time. I just wasn't paying attention." Ayanna looked at the water, then at him. "The river doesn't speak louder," she said softly. "You just learned how to hear." The river whispered against the stones as if agreeing. Seasons changed slowly in the borderlands, like pages turning in an old book. Summer's golden light gave way to cooler winds and soft, dusty skies. The cattle moved slower in the fields, the days grew shorter, and the nights felt longer and quieter. But for Thomas, everything looked different now. The same land he had grown up on now seemed to breathe with stories he had never noticed before. The river became a part of his daily rhythm, not just a place to water the horses or to sit in silence. It had become a teacher. Every ripple in the water, every rustle of the cottonwood trees, every cool breeze that carried the smell of earth, all of it seemed alive to him now. He had learned to hear it in the way Ayanna had taught him, with quiet ears and an open heart. The uneasy whispers in town did not disappear overnight. Some men still spoke with suspicion. Some avoided the river altogether. But a few began to understand slowly. After the meeting near the cottonwoods, a thin but real line of respect had begun to form. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Thomas often helped his father on the ranch during the day, but when the sun set and the sky turned orange and purple, he would ride toward the river. Sometimes Ayanna was there, sometimes she wasn't. When she wasn't, he still felt her presence in the way the wind moved through the trees. When she was, they shared quiet moments by the water, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as two people who had chosen to listen to the same land. Ayanna's people continued to visit the river too, just as they always had. They came at dusk to sing their songs softly into the wind. Sometimes they brought baskets of herbs, sometimes they danced around a small fire. Thomas watched from a distance when he wasn't invited closer, and when he was, he stepped with respect, never forgetting that this was their sacred space long before it was anyone's property. One evening, as the sky turned the color of fading embers, Thomas found Ayanna sitting on a smooth rock near the water. The light of the setting sun touched the river gently, turning it gold. She looked peaceful, her hair loose and shining in the last glow of the day. She didn't turn around when he approached. She knew he was there by the soft sound of Dusty's steps. He tied the horse to a low branch and walked closer. "Evening," he said quietly. Ayanna nodded. "The river is calm tonight," she said softly. "It listens." Thomas sat down a few feet away, letting the cool earth press against his palms. "I've learned a lot from this place," he said. "I used to think the world was just fences and work. Now I know it's bigger than that." Ayanna glanced at him with a faint smile, a small knowing one. "The land is old," she said. "Older than your fences. It remembers everything." For a while neither of them spoke. The night settled slowly around them, like a warm blanket wrapping the world. A coyote sang in the distance. The stars began to appear one by one like old friends arriving quietly. Thomas broke the silence after a while. "People in town still talk," he said softly. "Some don't like what they don't understand." Ayanna picked up a small flat stone and let it slide across the water's surface. It skipped twice before sinking. "The river doesn't change because people talk," she said calmly. "It just keeps flowing." Her words stayed with him. She had a way of speaking that made simple sentences feel like truths written into the earth itself. Thomas leaned back on his hands and stared up at the stars, feeling a strange calmness wash over him. As the weeks turned to months, Thomas became someone the Apache elders began to recognize. They didn't see him as one of their own, but they no longer saw him as just a rancher passing through. When he walked near the river now, they nodded at him. Sometimes they spoke to him in their soft, measured way. He didn't always understand their language, but he listened. And that alone mattered. One evening, the elders allowed Thomas to join a small gathering by the fire near the riverbank. They shared stories about the land, stories passed down through generations. One elder told of a time when the river was a guide for travelers, Another spoke of the cottonwoods being guardians of memory. Their words were slow, deep, and full of meaning. Thomas sat quietly, his hands folded on his knees, his eyes on the flames. Ayanna sat a few steps away, watching him. She had seen his heart change over the months, not with loud declarations, but with small, steady actions. She trusted him now, in a way she hadn't in the beginning. When the fire burned lower and the stars shone brighter, Ayanna's uncle spoke to Thomas for the first time. His voice was low and clear, the kind of voice that came from someone who carried many years of wisdom. "The river remembers," the elder said, "and it remembers you now too." Thomas lowered his head slightly, humbled. "I'm grateful," he said softly. The elder gave a slow nod. "You stepped where you should not have stepped once," he said. "But then you learned to walk with your head bowed to the land. That is not something many men do." Those words filled Thomas with a warmth he could not explain. It wasn't pride. It was something gentler, like being accepted by the land itself. As winter approached, the air grew colder. The river's song changed too. Softer, slower, like an old melody sung by a tired but loving voice. Ayanna and Thomas still met by the river from time to time, but it wasn't always about talking. Sometimes they simply sat together and watched the water flow. They both understood that what existed between them was something quiet and meaningful, born not from promises or plans, but from the way two lives touched a shared piece of land. Thomas never tried to claim it. She never asked him to. The river belonged to itself, and that was enough. In town, people slowly noticed the changes too. Some ranchers began to leave more space near the river. A few even spoke more softly when they mentioned the Apache camp. The shift was slow, like the changing of a tide, but it was real. And in that slow change, something good was taking root. One cold evening, when the sky was full of stars and the moon was bright, Thomas returned to the river after finishing his work. Ayanna was already there, standing with her feet in the shallow edge of the water. Her shawl fluttered gently in the wind, and the moonlight made her look like part of the land itself, not just someone living on it. Thomas stepped beside her, his boots sinking lightly into the soft earth. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The river's whisper filled the silence between them. Finally, Ayanna spoke. "Do you remember the first night you came here?" she asked softly. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I do," he said. "I was foolish. I didn't understand what this place was. I didn't understand you." She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him. "But now you do," Thomas nodded. "Now I do." She looked back at the water, her voice steady and calm. "The river forgives those who learn to listen. Not because it forgets, but because it carries the lesson forward." Her words wrapped around him like the cool night air. They didn't need to talk about the past any longer. What mattered was what had grown in the quiet space after it. Winter passed slowly. Snow dusted the far hills and frost formed delicate patterns along the riverbank in the mornings. The air smelled clean and sharp. Thomas worked harder than ever on the ranch, but every evening, he still rode to the cottonwood grove. The land had become more than just a place to live. It had become a part of him. Years later, people in the town would remember how things slowly changed by the river. They would speak of the time when there was distance between the ranchers and the Apache people, and how that distance grew smaller, not because of laws or force, but because two young people had learned to see the land through the same eyes. Thomas grew older, and so did Ayanna. Life carried them forward, as rivers always do, but they never forgot the quiet nights by the water, the stars above, and the soft sound of the wind moving through the trees. The river never stopped flowing. It carried their stories the same way it had carried the stories of countless others before them. Some nights, even long after their lives had changed, Thomas would walk to the river alone and place his hand on the cold stones. He would close his eyes and hear everything, the wind, the water, the memories. He knew that this story wasn't just his. It belonged to the land. It belonged to Ayanna. It belonged to the river, and the river remembered.